You might think you know Barron Trump, but what if I told you he walked into a courtroom and left everyone speechless, including the judge and top lawyers? This isn't just about a famous name, it's about proving yourself when everyone doubts you. It was a crisp autumn morning in New York City, and the towering marble columns of the Supreme Court of New York, Civil Division, gleamed under the sunlight. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal analysts, and curious spectators filled every available seat. The buzz of whispered conversations and the occasional click of cameras created a low hum of anticipation. Everyone expected a spectacle. Today was the hearing in a high-profile corporate dispute involving the Trump family business, and at the center of the storm stood Barron Trump, only 18 years old, set to argue his own case. Most of the people gathered weren't expecting brilliance. They were waiting to see the teenage son of a former president stumble under pressure, assuming this was just another display of privilege. At the head of the courtroom, Judge William Prescott, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s known for his strict courtroom demeanor and intolerance for arrogance, reviewed the case file with a skeptical frown. He had seen powerful people walk into his court thinking their name alone was enough to win, and he wasn't about to let that happen here. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with expectation, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first move. The double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Barron Trump stepped inside, walking with quiet confidence that seemed at odds with his youth. Dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, his tall frame and calm demeanor drew immediate attention. Yet, despite his composed exterior, many in the room still saw only a last name, not a person. Assuming he was just another privileged heir playing at adulthood. Most expected him to rely on his family's legal team, but as Barron approached the front, he carried his own set of documents, organized and clipped neatly in a leather folder. Sitting behind him, Daniel Holt, the Trump family's seasoned attorney, remained silent, present only in an advisory role. This was Barron's fight, and he intended to take it head-on. The case itself involved a major dispute over a family business deal gone wrong, with millions of dollars at stake and reputations hanging in the balance. But for Barron, this wasn't just about money, it was about proving himself. Judge Prescott glanced over his glasses, eyeing Barron with thinly veiled skepticism. "Mr. Trump," he said, "are you sure you want to represent yourself today?" Barron's reply was simple, steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready." Across the aisle, Evelyn Marks, the lead attorney for the opposing party, adjusted her designer blazer and stood with a confidence only years of courtroom victories could give. A seasoned litigator in her 50s, Evelyn was known for her razor-sharp arguments and unshakable poise, and today she fully expected an easy win. She eyed Barron with a subtle smirk, as if already dismissing him as a serious opponent. As she approached the podium, her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, echoing in the tense silence. "Your Honor," she began smoothly, "it's not every day we see a case like this, or, shall I say, a representative like Mr. Trump." Her tone was polite but laced with thinly veiled sarcasm, drawing a few quiet chuckles from the gallery. Evelyn continued, "While I respect anyone's right to represent themselves, I do hope the court will be patient as we navigate what may be a learning experience for him." The slight mockery hung in the air as she began her opening argument, painting Barron as unprepared, inexperienced, and far out of his depth. Her confidence was clear. She thought this would be an easy case to win. What she didn't expect was what Barron had in store. After Evelyn Marks wrapped up her opening statement, clearly satisfied with the groundwork she had laid, Judge William Prescott turned his sharp gaze toward Barron, adjusting his glasses as he leaned slightly forward in his chair. The judge's expression was unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of skepticism in his eyes, a look he often reserved for defendants or attorneys he didn't expect much from. "Mr. Trump," he began, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge, "before we proceed, I want to give you an opportunity to reconsider." The courtroom grew quiet as Judge Prescott continued. "Representing yourself in a case of this magnitude with this much at stake is not something I take lightly. I'll ask you plainly, are you sure you're prepared to argue against an attorney of Ms. Marks' caliber? This isn't a classroom debate, son." The words hung in the air, and a few spectators exchanged glances, some even smirking at what they assumed would be Barron's inevitable retreat. But Barron didn't flinch. Sitting up straighter, he met the judge's gaze calmly and replied, "I understand the risks, Your Honor. But yes, I'm prepared." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but he nodded. "Very well, Mr. Trump, proceed." With the courtroom now still and every eye trained on him, Barron Trump rose from his seat and approached the podium with quiet confidence. There was no nervous shuffling, no hesitation, just calm, deliberate steps. Placing his carefully organized notes on the stand, he adjusted the microphone, glanced once at Judge Prescott, and began to speak. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented a compelling argument, but one built on a flawed interpretation of precedent," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying through the room. A few heads turned, surprised by the ease with which he spoke. "Specifically," Barron continued, "Ms. Marks relies heavily on the ruling in Franklin v. Dunham to dismiss key testimony, but respectfully, that case dealt with procedural violations not relevant to the situation at hand." As murmurs rippled through the audience, Barron flipped a page in his notes, unfazed. "If I may, Your Honor, I would instead direct the court's attention to Mallory v. Beckman, where the admissibility of witness testimony under similar corporate disputes was upheld, precisely because no coercion or procedural fault was present." At that, even Evelyn Marks straightened slightly, her smirk fading as she scanned her own documents. Barron's delivery was methodical, well-researched, and undeniably polished, as though he had spent years preparing for this moment. Judge Prescott watched him carefully now, his earlier skepticism replaced with something more curious. Barron paused, looking directly at the judge. "For these reasons, I respectfully argue that the testimony remains admissible." The courtroom was silent, and for the first time people were beginning to realize this was no ordinary 18-year-old. For a brief moment, Evelyn Marks sat still, her eyes narrowing as she processed Barron's argument. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she stood and walked back to the podium, her heels clicking sharply against the polished courtroom floor. The faintest smile returned to her lips, the smile of a seasoned litigator ready to strike. "Your Honor," she began smoothly, "while I certainly appreciate Mr. Trump's enthusiasm, I think it's important to ground ourselves in reality." Her tone was measured but dripping with condescension, clearly aimed at undermining Barron's credibility. "Yes, Mallory Beckman did address admissibility, but Mr. Trump conveniently omits that the court in that case made an exception based on specific evidentiary flaws, something not present here." She glanced toward the judge, as if inviting him to agree. "Furthermore, I would argue that while Mr. Trump has clearly done his homework, this is not a matter of citing law school cases for show. It's about understanding how these precedents apply in real courtrooms. And with all due respect, Your Honor, I'm not convinced he fully grasps that distinction." Evelyn stepped back confidently, expecting her words to reclaim control of the room, but as she sat, her eyes flickered to Barron, who remained composed and very much ready to respond. Barron didn't flinch at Evelyn's carefully worded attack. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath and calmly rose to his feet, adjusting his suit jacket with quiet confidence. As he approached the podium once more, the room seemed to lean in, waiting to see if he would crack under the pressure. But there was no crack, only resolve. "Your Honor," Barron began, his voice unwavering, "I appreciate Ms. Marks' attempt to reframe the facts, but respectfully, she has mischaracterized the central holding in Mallory v. Beckman." He flipped open his file and held up a copy of the ruling, pointing to a highlighted section. The exception referenced in Mallory was specific to the method by which evidence was gathered, not to the admissibility of uncoerced, direct testimony from a corporate witness. That is clearly outlined on page 14 of the ruling. The judge leaned forward slightly, clearly following. Barron continued, "Furthermore, Ms. Marks suggests that I'm citing precedent out of context, but if anything, her use of Franklin v. Dunham stretches beyond the scope of that case's actual finding, which involved procedural misconduct that is completely absent in this case." He turned briefly to Evelyn, holding her gaze with calm professionalism before finishing. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the opposing counsel's dismissal of these precedents doesn't negate their applicability, and I stand by my argument." As Barron stepped back, the courtroom was silent, and for the first time it was clear he had seized control of the room. As Barron returned to his seat, Judge Prescott sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, studying the young man before him with a newfound intensity. Gone was the thinly veiled skepticism and faint smirk he had worn earlier, replaced now with something closer to respect, or at the very least, serious consideration. The judge glanced down at his notes, flipping briefly through the case file, then looked back up, addressing Barron directly. "Mr. Trump," he said, his tone noticeably softer, though still sharp, "you've made some compelling points. Tell me, are you prepared to respond to additional questions on your interpretation of Mallory v. Beckman?" The courtroom stirred at the question. It was clear Prescott wasn't just entertaining Barron anymore, he was testing him, engaging him like a real litigant. Barron sat up straighter, nodding confidently. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm fully prepared." A faint smile flickered across Prescott's face, and for the first time he regarded Barron not as a boy out of place, but as a capable figure holding his own. The shift was palpable, and even Evelyn Marks glanced at the judge with surprise, realizing that Barron Trump had earned his seat at that table, and the judge knew it. Though visibly rattled, Evelyn Marks wasn't ready to concede. She rose once more, adjusting her blazer as if to gather herself, and strode confidently back to the podium. "Your Honor," she began, her voice sharper now, "while Mr. Trump has certainly put on an impressive display, let's not forget that courtroom performance doesn't equate to legal soundness." She glanced around the room, ensuring the gallery heard her subtle jab. "I respect his preparation," she continued, "but this is a multi-million-dollar corporate case, not a debate club. We cannot overlook the fact that Mr. Trump, despite his eloquence, lacks formal legal training and experience to fully comprehend the far-reaching implications of these arguments." Evelyn's tone was controlled but dripping with condescension, and she turned pointedly to Judge Prescott. "Your Honor, at the end of the day, we must ask ourselves whether this court should allow arguments to proceed that, while articulate, may dangerously oversimplify complex legal issues simply because of who's delivering them." She gave a final, sharp look in Barron's direction, as though daring him to respond. But as she returned to her seat, there was a growing sense that her words, rather than swaying the court, had exposed her desperation to regain control. Barron rose slowly, taking a deep breath as he approached the podium one last time. The weight of Evelyn's dismissive words still hung in the air, but if they had been intended to rattle him, they failed. Instead, he stood straighter, his expression calm but resolute. Turning to face Judge Prescott, Barron began, "Your Honor, I appreciate Ms. Marks's concern about courtroom theatrics, but let me be clear, this is not a performance. It's about the law, it's about fairness, and it's about ensuring that justice isn't reserved only for those who look and sound like what people expect." The courtroom was still, everyone focused intently on him. Barron continued, "The fact that I am young or that I haven't attended law school yet doesn't change the validity of the legal precedents I've cited or the facts I've presented today. If anything, it highlights why we need to look past appearances. Ms. Marks would have this court believe that my arguments are dangerous because they come from someone inexperienced. But, Your Honor, isn't the greater danger ignoring sound reasoning simply because of who presents it?" He took a step closer to the bench, his voice unwavering but earnest. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking this court to consider the facts, the law, and what's right, because if we start deciding cases based on who we think is worthy to speak, then we undermine the very foundation of justice." Judge Prescott leaned back, watching Barron with a mixture of surprise and reflection. The courtroom remained frozen, every person realizing that Barron had just delivered not only a legal argument, but a statement about fairness and principle that would be hard to ignore. For a long moment, Judge Prescott sat silent, his hands folded thoughtfully on the bench as he stared at Barron. The weight of the moment was heavy, pressing down on everyone in the room. Even Evelyn Marks, who had maintained her confident exterior all morning, seemed to shift uncomfortably in her seat, realizing that the tide had turned. Finally, Prescott let out a long breath and adjusted his glasses, glancing down briefly at his notes before lifting his gaze to meet Barron's. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice firm but no longer dismissive. "You've done something today that few experienced attorneys manage to do: present a clear, logical, and well-reasoned argument grounded in the law, not theatrics." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and a few of the reporters, previously bored, now sat upright, furiously scribbling notes. Judge Prescott continued, "Your citations were accurate, your reasoning sound, and you've shown this court that respect for the law is not determined by age or title, but by preparation and understanding." He turned toward Evelyn briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Barron. "Therefore, this court rules that the testimony Mr. Trump defended will remain admissible." The words echoed through the room like a verdict in a high-profile trial. Gasps and whispers filled the air, and even Judge Prescott allowed himself a small nod of approval. "Consider this," he added, looking directly at Barron, "your first unofficial victory in the courtroom, and a reminder to everyone here: never underestimate the voice that comes prepared." As Barron gathered his papers, calm and composed, the room watched him with a mixture of awe and newfound respect. No longer just the son of a famous name, but a force in his own right. The story of Barron Trump standing his ground in court reminds us of a powerful lesson: never judge someone's abilities by their age, last name, or appearance. From the moment he walked into that courtroom, everyone expected Barron to fail, to be overwhelmed by experienced attorneys and dismissed by a skeptical judge. But through calm confidence, thorough preparation, and respect for the law, Barron not only defended his position, but earned the respect of an entire courtroom. His performance showed that true power lies not in titles or appearances, but in knowledge, integrity, and perseverance. In a world where people are too often judged on first impressions, this story is a reminder to look beyond the surface. Just because someone is young or underestimated doesn't mean they aren't capable of incredible things. Preparation and character always win over arrogance and assumptions. Barron's success in that courtroom wasn't handed to him, he earned it. His story is an example of why we should always be prepared to rise above expectations and prove ourselves through action, not just words. Never underestimate those who quietly do the work, because when their moment comes, they will rise.